Today's guest on a Life and a Living podcast, it's a real honor to have Ward Nye. Now, Ward is the chairman and CEO of an organization called Martin Marietta, which is a US-based company, is a member of the S&P 500, and is also a leading supplier of aggregates and heavy building materials in the US, Canada, and indeed in the Caribbean. But we're delighted to have Ward here to talk us through the challenges in the series of kind of leading through COVID-19. And, during this period of time, Ward and his team were able to post record, first half year financial results, which is extraordinary. They also had, very interestingly, and we talk about it, their record safety results in all of the over 400 locations that they have. But as a publicly quoted company, it does add a dimension to Ward's role, because not only is he talking about managing his staff, is not only talking about managing his customers, but he also has to manage his shareholders. And that does add a different dimension. And Ward talks about how he managed to do that, and very successfully, may I say, during that period. But also, what he learned about the real importance of openness, that people are able to put their hand up and say that when they had an issue, if they had a concern, if they made a mistake, but that openness that had been really bred in the organization in advance had stood them in during these difficult times. And also the resilience of his leadership team and the leaders in the organization. And again, that's not something that you start to build at a time of crisis. You really do have to build that in advance. So it's a fantastic story to listen to, the whole story of Ward and his team in Martin Marietta. And as I say, it does bring a different dimension when you're talking about a publicly quoted company that you're leading. So I really do, encourage you to listen to what Ward has got to say, because I think there are great lessons for all of us as we listen to his wisdom. Ward, it's a great pleasure to have you here on a Life and a Living podcast. I'm really thrilled that you would join me here today.
John, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. So listen, we're talking about leading through COVID, but let's put it in a bit of scale. And I think for people listening, to put your business, you're president and you're chairman and CEO of Martin Marietta Inc., which is, when we're talking about scale, it's in 29 US states, if I'm right. You're also operating in Canada, in the Caribbean. You have about 9,000 employees in about 400 locations. Have I got that kind of right?
That sounds about right. And the other thing that I would say on scale is our products are so heavy, we had to weigh them with scales. So scale, okay. We sell most of what we do by the ton, John. So it's a little different than many.
But when you talk about that size of organization, that's a big animal. That's a very, very large animal. And when suddenly something like COVID happens, which, let's face it, none of us were kind of absolutely set up and prepared for, how do you actually get an animal like that and, get it moving and to adjust to the COVID, the restrictions and everything? That must have been an enormous challenge.
It was an enormous challenge in the early days. And the primary thing that we did, John, that I think many did, and I think it served us all well, is we were focused candidly on over-communicating with our colleagues. And our view was, if we were able to do that, if we could demonstrate to them a clear plan, we had a path forward. We didn't know exactly where it was going to go, because there's never been a course on how to manage through COVID. But nonetheless, if we could put structure, if we could put process and continual communication to our employees, number one, that brought them great peace, and it let them know we're going to be fine as we go through that. It also gave them very specific tactical issues that they needed to be focused on, that let the organization be focused on what our strategic goals are as well. So it's been a fascinating year, because, as you said, when we go through a strategic planning process, at least at Martin Marietta, it's a once every 5-year undertaking. And if someone had told me coming into the year that in early March, we would send most of our corporate employees home, and we would go through a 5-year strategic plan, do it well, and roll it out to our board in a distant fashion. I'm not sure I would have believed that. But nonetheless, I think putting real structure to it and over communicating is what made those early days go quite well, and has made us, it's put us in a position that we've been able to sustain it all the way through COVID.
And what were some of the kind of the logistical challenges? Because I said, with that number of people, with that number of locations, with kind of your spread and your reach that great, what were some of the logistical kind of nightmares that you had to deal with to make sure that there was business continuity?
Well, in large part, the biggest challenges was making sure that our systems were holding up adequately. And you learn new ways of doing business. If you and I had spoken in late last year about the notion of doing a Zoom call, you and I both would have wondered, now what entirely is a Zoom call? But between this type of technology that we're using today and the way that our systems have held up, that's what's really made it work well. I think if someone had suggested that we could have as many people working remotely and have our systems enable that, have technology work so that we could close quarters, that we could have board meetings, that we could have safety meetings, that we could have ourselves in the position that we've had the safest year in Martin Marietta's history thus far this year, as measured from incident rate perspective, either lost time or total case. I'm not sure that any of us would have thought that that was entirely doable, but I do think, back to your question, making sure that your systems are robust and capable of keeping people in touch has been vitally important. The other thing that I was doing early on in COVID was sending a weekly update to our employees. And, John, they wouldn't be long. They would be about a page or a page and a half, but these were a page or a page and a half that you would spend a lot of time on, because every word mattered, and you were wanting to assure that you were telling your colleagues in clarity, but also in tone, exactly what was going on, what we believed was going to be next, and how they needed to be important parts of assuring that we got together to whatever was next. So communications and systems have made it work.
Yeah, I suppose also with that communication is because the reality was, and the reality is still, is that there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's being honest about not having all the answers or pretending to have all the answers. Isn't that part of it as well?
Well, and we said as much because, for example, we just told our employee base last week, don't expect to be back in a normal fashion this year. And that in the next sentence, and that doesn't mean that we're going to be back in a normal fashion in January either. And the fact is, that's okay. I mean, part of what we've seen this year, John, we turned in financially a record first half this year. And at the same time, if we look at the way this business and this industry tends to be able to sustain itself, it really has been extraordinary. But we've made it very clear to our employees, it won't be business as usual for a while, at least for corporate office employees. Now, in fairness, John, if you go to any one of those 400 operations that you referenced early on in the dialogue, what you'd find is those businesses are operating broadly as usual. And it's really been heartwarming to see the way that that has worked. Number one, they've worked safely. If we look at the incidence of COVID across our organization to date, with a 9,000 employee population, we've had about 165 positive cases, and almost none of it has been employee to employee spread. Right. And in large measure, that's driven by strict adherence to protocols, but still maintaining a degree of efficiency. So it's odd when I reflect on your question, because if we look in the quarries, it's business as usual. But if we think about what working in a quarry looks like, it's natural social distancing. So it becomes trickier when we're talking about a corporate office where I'm sitting today that would typically have 300 plus people here on this campus. And today we probably have around 30 that are here, and they're spread throughout 2 different buildings on a 12-acre campus. So we've been able to do that safely. But it's normal in some places, to your point, and it's not at all normal in others.
Yeah. And from your own role, presumably you had to make adjustments to how you went about your own. There you are, you're chairman, you're CEO, you're very actively involved in the day-to-day of the business. What adjustments did you find that you had to make to how you manage your own role?
The primary difference that I've had, I suppose, John, has been twofold. One, I haven't been out in the field in a position to see employees because it's unsafe to travel in many respects right now. So I felt like I needed, one, to set an example and not put myself and the company in peril. At the same time, I needed to maintain total accessibility to our employee group. So while I can't go out and get on planes and go to quarries the way that I would wish, I've come into the office almost every day. And I've come into the office keeping a normal schedule. And people who know me know that actually means a very early morning. I'm a morning person, and I like to be in the office beginning at about 6 a.m. for two reasons. One, I'm a morning guy, and I like to leverage my abilities early in the morning. But our quarries are early morning facilities as well. And what I wanted to make certain is if I can't be in the business as much as I would typically be in the business, I was going to make sure that people knew that I was at my post when they were theirs. So if issues came up, anyone needed to reach me, they could. And I see those communications and that level of accessibility in a public company important in two very distinct ways. One, how do you do it with your senior management team and your employee work base all the way through the company? But equally, how do you maintain it with a board of directors who are charged with governance and oversight in a public company? Because you're going through with them something too that is extraordinary, and they want to make sure that they're involved and aware and up to date as much as they can and should be, because they have fiduciary duties that need to be fulfilled. So you have several different competing tugs that you're managing in your mind as the CEO of a public company at that time. And what I tried to do was make sure that I was mindful of the different constituencies and then assure that there was availability and transparency and presence for all of them.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at that, I mean, as you say, your role, you're the chairman and CEO of a publicly quoted company, which brings another dimension altogether as well to that. And if you look back over this last period of 6 months, whatever it might be, what would you say was the biggest challenge for you as a leader and, you know, as a chairman and CEO, as professionally and personally?
To recognize that it was okay on occasion to step back. And that's really one of the challenges. One of my board members said to me very early on, and she was so right, she said, "Ward, everything about this smells like it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint." And I think remembering that is really important because you're working in many respects, though you're trying desperately to stay connected. You're still working in many respects in isolation. And that actually takes a toll on people over time. And I think recognizing that you have to manage your own expectations, your own calendar, your own needs a little bit differently. One, because that's what you need to do. Number two, if you don't do it, you're actually not servicing the people who you're there to service as well as you otherwise could. I've not been one who's typically been given to taking much time off. I don't need much time off. I can take short breaks and refresh, but equally I found that maybe a few more short breaks than normal. We've gone through this. And I think just recognizing that and accepting that that's perfectly okay has been something that took some adjustment for me as we've gone through it.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the challenges, and it's been interesting talking to other CEOs, is, you know, because everyone's working remotely, and I'm talking particularly with people that probably heretofore, a lot of them would have worked in the same building as you. So you're used to having that even kind of casual contact as well as kind of the informal contact as well as the formal contact. But now it's kind of everything is, as you say, is through Zoom. And there's the balance, and it's been interesting talking to different companies, the balance between staying connected to those people, but not making them feel that you're micromanaging them. How did you find getting that balance right? Because it's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. And here's what I would say too. You don't manage every person the same way.
No.
And So different people have different needs as managers or otherwise. And one of the things I've long spoken to our team about, and it's a lesson that I learned from people who I've worked for through the years, in many respects, you earn the right to be left alone to some degree. And different people need different degrees of autonomy, and some people need a closer hand. And the fact is, people usually know the difference. They know their own styles. And part of what's been comfortable and helpful about our team is this is a team that's largely been in place for a while. So we know each other well. We know when we need to get involved, and we know when we need to back off. And I think knowing both of those is critically important. We don't tend to be micromanagers here. This is a long-term business, and we manage it in a long-term way. Part of what you and I discussed in some of our earlier conversations is values are important to Martin Marietta. So if we know we have people who are committed to health, safety, community welfare, customer service, efficiencies, production, etc., we know we're going to have the results that we need. And it's been so imbued into our culture that the need to micromanage hasn't so much been there. And for that, we're very, very grateful. We don't see a high degree of turnover, and that lack of turnover and that degree of stability lets us go through a time when we can't be in the same room together. And you do miss that personal synergy that comes from human beings being together. But nonetheless, we've been able to bridge it, and bridge it well so far, John.
That's great. And when you look kind of down through the organization, because as you said, your own leadership team is a team that's been together and you're for quite some time, and you've got your own cadence and rhythm to working together. But when you look down through the organization, and we were chatting about it, before we started the interview, you talk about people where there's a family where both partners are working, they're trying to homeschool children at the same time, and there are real challenges. What has Martin Marietta done to actually support your people during that time with that sort of stress?
Well, we first of all, we hire people for a career. We don't hire them for a job. And that's such an important foundation when people come here, because they know we're going to be there and we're going to support them through difficult moments. I do think our systems have made that work. So if someone is having to homeschool children and they're going to have some hours in the middle of the day that they're going to be dedicated to taking care of young ones and putting them through class, what we've seen is they're getting up a little bit earlier, or maybe pushing a little bit more on the other end of the day, or on occasion, using a little bit of Saturday and Sunday to make some of that up. And it's worked, and it's worked well. We tried not to be horribly prescriptive about what people need to do. It's easy to look to see that your metrics and the things that need to happen are continuing to happen. To your point, John, if you're a publicly traded company, every quarter you're going to report your earnings. And every quarter you have to put out a 10Q. At the end of the year, you have to put out a 10K, and they have to be right. So we recognize that on occasion, it's just game time, and people have to be ready for game time. But at the same time, if they've run into personal issues, the beauty of this organization is you raise your hand, you make sure people understand that you have an issue, because we're really good about two things. One, if you say, I've dropped the ball or I've made a mistake and you need help, people will give you help. And if you say, I've made a mistake and I'm sorry, that's fine. You just dust yourself off and keep going. So I do think that degree of honesty that we have between each other and colleagues on not being afraid to say, I've got an issue, I need some help, this is the jam that I'm in. What can we do together to navigate through that is important, because I do think there are organizations around the globe where people are afraid to do that. And I think when they're afraid to raise their hand and be that honest, because the consequences may be difficult, they actually put themselves, put the organization in a perilous spot. And we've been able to avoid that, I think, in large measure through culture and through expectations.
Yeah. And if you look back over this period, which has been, unprecedented is a word that's kind of bandied around, but let's face it, it's actually pretty relevant in this situation. But if you look back over that period, would you do things differently? Are there things that you say, oh yeah, I wish we had done that, or wish we hadn't done that, or would you change anything that you had done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I'll tell you is that was a conversation that part of our management team was having last week. And mercifully, to date, I'm sure there's some things around the edge that we might do differently. I don't think we've missed anything big. And that's what's so important. If you can get most of it right today, that's a pretty good place to be. And having the most profitable first half in the company's history is really a testament to our team. Having the safest year in our company's history is a testament to the team. Being able to get a strategic plan done is a testament to the team. So as we look at what's happened, there are not a lot of things, John, that I would say, let's go back, punt, and do a redo on that
Right.
piece of it. So, and again, we're very fortunate with that. I do think structure and communication that we discussed early on are the two things that have made that happen.
Yeah. Can I ask you just because I'm really curious about it, and sorry, it keeps coming up, and you've said it a few times, is that the safety level has been at an all-time high. Why is that, particularly in this time?
Yeah, maybe it's because we're all walking around wearing these masks. It's always been something that has been important to our business. I always remind people, we blow things up for a living. We operate haul trucks that carry 100 tons of material and can back over your car and never know it. So it's an industry that you have to be acutely aware of others. And our safety program is branded here as our Guardian Angel safety program. We're looking out for ourselves. We're looking out for each other. And I do think going into COVID and introducing the protocols and wearing the masks and adding one more element to what people need to think about, raise their overall game as well. And I think that was really important. The other piece of it, and I think this was important too, we were deemed an essential business. And our employees and everyone were very grateful that we were deemed an essential business, but it was something that we never took for granted. And I think we recognized that as an essential business, if it looked like the wheels in any respect were coming off, we could lose that coveted designation. And that was important to our customers, that was important to our employees, because it kept people working and kept the nation moving. So I think there were a host of things that have gone into it. One reason that we focus so much on safety, John, one is the obvious one. It's simply the right thing to do. You want people to go home at the end of the day in the same condition that they came to work. The other piece of it is it's simply good business. If people are working safely, if they're working efficiently, if you're not having workers' compensation claims, if just a whole host of the bad things that can happen when people get hurt don't happen, you're running a much more efficient business. One of the things that I like to share with our employees is in the stone business in the United States, we sell stone on average for about $14 a ton, John. Now, there are very few things in your life that you want that you can buy for $14 a ton. So what it tells us is you have to be really very, very good on the production side to make those numbers work. And safety is the tip of our spear. And it really has, I think it's set us apart. I've commented, it's safer to work in a mine in Martin Marietta than it is to work in most department stores. And that's a pitch that most people probably don't see coming.
Absolutely. But it's a very interesting byproduct of this time, and not one that you would kind of naturally think about. Just curious, Ward, as you look back on this time, I mean, what did you learn about yourself, your team, and your business when you reflect on it?
Well, I think probably a lot of things, and some of them I don't know that we'll know until about 5 or 10 years out, and we reflect on it. I can't wait to read the books that are written about retrospect. I think one of the things that we've learned is it is a remarkably resilient business, and this is a remarkably resilient company. And when you think you can't do something, the fact is you probably can, and you need to continue to challenge yourself. And when people are telling you, no, these are things you cannot do, the primary thing you have to say is, I can't really take that as an answer. We are going to find a way to come through this. And that's what we've seen with our teams. They have continued in every respect to rise to the occasion. And I think if I come back and really answer your question directly, it has been the resiliency of teams, the ingenuity of people, and the desire to see the other side of this and see it in a good way. And there are a number of businesses, John, and you and I know it, that will not come through this well. We will. And I think our teams know that, and they're wholly committed to getting there. So the resilience factor has been touching.
Yeah. But I think also, excuse me, I think also, Ward, to say is that, that resilience, you don't start to build that resilience during a crisis, right? You've built that resilience over a number of years. And it's a testimony to the work that, you and the team have done at Martin Marietta to actually build yourselves into that high performing team that enabled you to manage during this time. Because the teams that are not at that level in terms of performance and capacity, are the businesses, many of them which are struggling right now. So I think that it's to be commended. And for anybody listening, it's the time to build the high performing team is now, if you don't have it right now. But don't wait for the crisis because that's not the time to start doing it. It's not the optimum time to be throwing the water over the side of the boat when there's a hole in it. And I think that's a great testimony to what you and the team have done in Martin Marietta. If I was to ask you, I know this is a bit of a kind of a crystal ball. Well, it is a crystal ball, not kind of, very much. I mean, you're saying obviously it's going to be into 2021 before you get certainly your people in the head office back in, and God only knows when that'll be in that time. But when this all settles down, I think everybody is agreeing that we're not going to go back to the way it was. But nobody's quite sure about what it is going to look like. At this stage, do you have a view of what you think it might look like? I mean, in your plants and in your different locations and your quarries, it probably doesn't change a huge amount. But when you look at your head office, it probably does look quite different.
Yeah, I think it's going to look quite different in some ways, and it's going to look remarkably similar in others. I think we'll be driven by two things. One, what are the needs? So what does the company need, and what does the company require? And what is the need and require that it can do safely? So we let that be our lodestar as we look at it. I think the second part is, what are going to be varying degrees of desire? And that is looking at an employee base and what can they do as efficiently or more efficiently, perhaps remotely, than they can in the office. There are going to be some functions, John, that we can look at from a remote perspective that can be extraordinarily efficient, not come into the office, and probably attract and retain better employees simply by approaching it that way. But there are going to be others. There are different functions that having the person next door and being able to walk to the office next door and knock things around and debate them and discuss them, and simply back to that notion we discussed earlier, the synergy of people being together that is going to be required. The other thing that's going to be fascinating is there have been always a group of people who've always wanted to work remotely. I bet many of them may want to come back to work now. I think there's a sense in which while remote work has some degree of allure to it, this has been a lot of alone time for people, and I think our teams have genuinely missed each other. They're ready in many respects to come back to work. I do think though that we will see different shifts working in different ways, and we may have the building largely full again one day, but it probably won't be entirely as it was pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think that, I think as human beings, we're kind of wired to connect with each other and not always virtually. And I think there's going to be that kind of physical connection that we all need to have as well, because I think that we're somewhat built that way. But Ward, this has been fascinating, but I'm really curious, and I'm sure my audience is curious, that what is the chairman and CEO of a publicly quoted company like Martin Marietta, a book that you have read that's had an impact upon you? Which book it was? I suppose it's kind of a question of selection, but which one it is and what impact it had.
It's interesting. Years ago, I read the book on Lincoln called Team of Rivals, and it was such a great example of how you build a team that at times doesn't always think exactly the way that you do. You want to build a team that will question you, a team that will challenge you, a team that will understand you and respect you and support one another. But still, bringing different perspectives is so incredibly valuable. When that book came out, it's been a decade plus now. It's probably been maybe 15, 16 years. But I read that book, and as the team and I have done our part to try to help shape this business, it's been something that I've kept not just in the back of my mind, in the forefront of my mind.
Well, I think that also plays into the whole, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion today about diversity. And very often when people talk about diversity and inclusivity, we talk about gender and race, but it actually goes much beyond that. And I think it is about having that diversity, because I've always thought, and from my own background in the corporate world, that if I was sitting in a room and everybody was agreeing with me, that was probably a very dangerous place to be. So.
I agree with you. Certainly from my perspective, it'd be a dangerous.
So, and also daily rituals, do you have them? You're obviously an early riser. Do you have other daily rituals that kind of set you up for the day?
Yeah, that is primarily it. I get up early, I eat an early breakfast, and I come straight into work. And I try so hard to leverage my time from 6 in the morning till about noontime, because I know that's going to be my highest level or window of productivity. And I equally know it at the end of the evening when it's time to put it all down. So you have to have, at least from my perspective, a time to start and a time to end. It doesn't work that way every day, but most days, if I'm looking at ritual, I'm driven by habit, and there are very few surprises, at least to my personal structure each day.
Well, it has stood you well, Ward. Thank you so much indeed for being a guest today. It's been a real honor and a pleasure, and we're thrilled that you gave us some of your really, really valuable time.
John, thank you very much. Stay well and stay safe.
Take care.